For almost 6 years after leaving my narcissistic ex, my recovery looked the same. I would have a good stretch. A few great days, sometimes a couple of weeks, where I felt clear. Mentally, I understood what had happened. I would feel like I was finally turning the corner. And then it would collapse. Something would trigger me. The clarity would disappear. The old thoughts would flood back in. And I would find myself right back in the same emotional place I had been months before, wondering what I was doing wrong. I spent a long time believing that meant I was weak or broken, or that I was not trying hard enough. I thought that other people recovered faster because they were stronger or smarter or less damaged than I was. Come to find out, that was not the problem. The problem was that I was trying to recover through feelings, through motivation, and moments of clarity that I assumed would stick if I just believed in them hard enough. And none of that is stable enough to build real recovery on. What I eventually learned, and what I want to explain in this video, is that recovery from narcissistic abuse is not a feeling you finally arrive at. It is a system you build. And until I understood that difference, I kept finding myself looping back to the same place for years. Here is how recovery works for most survivors in the beginning. And even when I went through this same situation, I also lived inside this pattern for a very long time before I could finally see what was happening. You have a moment of clarity. Maybe you read something that clicks. Or you watch a video that names your experience perfectly. Maybe you wake up one morning and just feel done with it all. And in that moment, everything seems clear. You understand what happened. You understand what you need to do. You feel ready. So you ride that wave. You feel motivated. You make decisions. Maybe you commit to no contact. Maybe you start journaling. Maybe you tell yourself this is the turning point. But then the wave passes. The feeling that made everything seem so clear starts to fade. And without that feeling driving you, the old patterns creep back in. The overthinking and doubt, mixed with confusion. The mental replaying starts over. Then it's inevitable you start to feel the pull toward the person you are trying to separate from. And then you judge yourself for it. You think, I was doing so well. What happened? You feel like you lost progress, like you slipped backward. But here is the problem. You did not lose progress. You lost the feeling. And you are using the feeling as the foundation for everything. I know that pattern from the inside. I rode that wave and crashed dozens of times before I realized the wave was never going to carry me all the way. Not because I was not committed, but because feelings after narcissistic abuse are not stable enough to be the thing you build your recovery on. Recovery has to be built as a system. Something that holds its shape even on the days when you feel nothing. Or when you feel everything. Or when you feel pulled in a direction you know is not good for you. Let me explain what that actually means. Our feelings after narcissistic abuse are not reliable indicators of progress. This was the first thing I had to accept, and it took me longer than I would like to admit, is that my emotional state was not a trustworthy measure of how my recovery was going. Not because my feelings were not real. They were. But because they had been so thoroughly disrupted by what I had been through that they could not hold a consistent signal. This is not unique to me. It is what happens to your emotional system after sustained psychological manipulation. During a narcissistic relationship, your emotions are constantly being interfered with. They are triggered, suppressed, redirected, and used against you. You are made to feel guilty when you have done nothing wrong. You are made to feel grateful for basic decency. You are made to feel unstable for having reasonable reactions to unreasonable behavior. After that kind of sustained interference, your emotional responses do not just snap back to normal when the relationship ends. They remain dysregulated. They overreact to some things and underreact to others. They fluctuate in ways that do not match your actual circumstances. Here is what this looked like for me, and I think a lot of you will recognize this. On Monday, I would feel empowered and clear. By Wednesday, something small would trigger a memory, and suddenly I would feel a wave of longing for someone I knew had damaged me. By Friday, I felt numb and disconnected from everything. None of those emotional states accurately reflected where I was in recovery. They were just my nervous system doing what a dysregulated nervous system does, cycling through reactions that were still tethered to the old patterns. When I used those feelings as my compass, my recovery went wherever my emotions went, which meant it was unstable, inconsistent, and easily derailed. This does not mean feelings are irrelevant. They carry important information, but they cannot be the structure. They cannot be the thing you depend on to keep you moving in the right direction. You need something underneath the feelings that stays in place regardless of what your emotional state is doing on any given day. I did not figure that out for years, and I want to save you some of that time. Next is, awareness without a process creates the illusion of recovery. This is the second pattern that kept me stuck for a long time, and it is very common among survivors who have done a lot of research into narcissistic abuse. I knew what love bombing was. I knew what gaslighting was. I could identify the idealize, devalue, discard cycle. I understood trauma bonding as a concept. I could explain the dynamics of what had happened to me with real clarity. And I was still stuck. That confused me for a long time. I thought understanding was the same as recovering. I thought if I just learned enough, read enough, consumed enough content about narcissistic abuse, the feelings would eventually catch up to the knowledge. They did not. This is what happens when awareness becomes the entire recovery strategy. You learn more and more about what happened to you, and that learning feels productive. It feels like progress. Each new piece of information creates a moment of recognition and relief. But over time, you start to notice that you are circling the same ground. You are learning the same things in different words. You are recognizing the same patterns. And the emotional experience underneath all of that knowledge has not actually shifted. I call this the awareness trap. It is when understanding the problem becomes a substitute for actually working through it. Here is a version of this I think many of you will relate to. You spend months reading about narcissistic abuse. Books, podcasts, videos, articles, forums. You have a sophisticated understanding of the dynamics. You can spot a narcissist from a mile away, but you are still emotionally reactive to your ex. You are still ruminating. You still have not built a daily structure that supports your detachment. You still reach for content about narcissistic abuse every time you feel triggered because learning has become your coping mechanism instead of your starting point. That is not recovery. That is research. And I say that with respect because I lived in that mode for a long time. But research without application will keep you informed without keeping you moving. Real recovery requires taking what you know and converting it into consistent action. Not dramatic action. Not one-time decisions made during an emotional peak. Repeated, structured, often undramatic action that interrupts the conditioned patterns over and over until they start to lose their hold. Awareness tells you what happened. A system tells you what to do about it, and when and how, and what to do when you lose your footing. If you are recognizing this pattern in your own experience, if you have been learning a lot but feeling like the emotional side of things has not caught up, there is a free trauma bond self-assessment linked in the description below this video. It will help you identify what is actually still active underneath all the awareness, so you can start directing your energy toward the specific patterns that are keeping you stuck. It takes a few minutes, and it is free. Before we get to the third point, if you're still with me, drop a purple heart in the comments, so that we can celebrate the light at the end of a very dark tunnel. There's life after this, and we need to stick together so that we know that we are not alone. Okay, so the last thing that I learned is structured recovery works because it does not depend on how you feel. Now, this is the last piece where everything we have talked about comes together. And this is the thing that eventually changed everything for me. If feelings are unreliable after narcissistic abuse, and if awareness alone is not enough to create change, then what is work? Structure. A repeatable process that you follow not because you feel like it, but because it is designed to produce specific results over time regardless of your emotional state. Let me explain what that means in simple terms, because when I first encountered this idea, it sounded cold. It sounded mechanical. I thought recovery was supposed to feel like something, like a breakthrough, like an emotional release, like finally being free. And those moments can happen, but they are not the engine. They are the byproduct. A structured recovery process is a set of deliberate steps that you return to consistently. It includes things like identifying which trauma bond patterns are still active in your daily life, practicing specific pattern interruptions when those patterns show up, building a daily or weekly rhythm that supports nervous system regulation, tracking what triggers you and how you respond over time, working through the layers of the bond in a sequence that makes sense, instead of jumping between topics based on whatever feels most urgent in the moment. None of that is glamorous. None of it produces the kind of emotional high you get from a breakthrough moment of clarity. But that is exactly the point. Let me show you the difference between what recovery looked like for me before I had structure and after. Before structure, I felt motivated, so I journaled. I felt triggered, so I researched narcissistic abuse. I felt strong, so I committed to no contact. I felt weak, so I broke it. Every action was driven by the emotional state I was in at the time, which meant the actions were inconsistent and often contradictory. After structure, I journaled on a set schedule, not because I felt like it, but because it was part of the process. I practiced a specific response when I was triggered instead of defaulting to research or rumination. I maintained no contact not because I felt strong enough, but because the structure held it in place on the days when I did not feel strong. I followed a sequence of steps that addressed the cognitive layer, then the emotional layer, then the nervous system layer, in an order that allowed each one to build on the one before it. The difference was not in effort. I was trying just as hard before. The difference was in reliability. One approach held its shape on bad days. The other collapsed exactly when I needed it most. This is not about being rigid or mechanical. It is about having something underneath you that does not move every time your feelings shift. Because after narcissistic abuse, your feelings are going to shift. A lot. And the question is not whether that will happen. The question is whether your recovery process can absorb that instability without falling apart. A system can. A mood cannot. That is the thing that finally got me out of the loop after 6 years. Not a better feeling. A better process. So here is what I want to leave you with. And I am saying this as someone who spent years stuck in exactly the cycle I described today. If your recovery has felt unstable, inconsistent, or like it keeps resetting, that is not a reflection of how committed you are. It is almost always a reflection of what your recovery is built on. When recovery is built on feelings, it rises and falls with your emotional state. When it is built on insight, it stalls once the learning stops producing new breakthroughs. When it is built on motivation, it lasts exactly as long as the motivation does, which after narcissistic abuse is usually not very long. But when recovery is built as a system, it becomes something you can return to even when you feel lost, even when the clarity is gone, even when the old pull shows up and your emotions are telling you to go backward. The system does not need you to feel ready. It just needs you to follow the next step. That is not a small distinction. For me, it was the difference between looping in the same place for 6 years and actually moving through the stages of recovery in a way that produced lasting change. Recovery from narcissistic abuse is not a feeling you find. It is a process you build. And it starts with knowing where you actually are so that the process you build is matched to the right problem. That is what the free trauma bond self-assessment in the description is designed to help you do. It gives you a clear picture of what patterns are still active in your recovery right now, so you're not guessing and not depending on how you feel to figure out your next step. It is free. It takes a few minutes. And it is one of the most practical starting points you can use to begin building the kind of structured recovery we talked about today. The link is in the description. I will see you in the next one.